Thank you all for coming, for tearing yourselves away from the TV screens. I'm glad you have your priorities straight. When I taught religion to undergraduates at the universities in this area, principally Seattle U, a lot of times it would happen that the students would tell me that their favorite lecture was the one where I talked about my own involvement with religion. Well, it was here at this church, in this denomination, that my religion involvement really began. So it feels right and even overdue that I speak here about that and tell my story. I think that we all have stories and need to do better about sharing them with one another. So I just want to, I hope telling my story encourages all of you to share your stories as well. My story involves the values and guidance that this church gave me during the 12 years I was a member here. It involves my ordination, my work for the Presbyterian denomination, new ideas that I learned along the way that I hadn't learned here, if you can believe that. And many people over the years who have shared their wisdom with me and supported me. So here's my story of my involvement with religion. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Let's see. My parents and I moved to this island in 1943. I was 3 years old. And we became involved with the Emmanuel Episcopal Church, the main church on the island at that time, down in East Seattle. That's where I was christened, and that's where I went to Sunday school. And I participated in the Episcopal liturgy as a choir boy, even though I couldn't carry a tune, and still can't today. One day I complained to my parents that they were taking me to Sunday school every week, but then they were going home and not attending the church themselves. Hypocrisy? Anyway, it was very shortly after I raised that with them that we visited this church, which at the time was holding its services at the Mercer Crest School. So that was in 1953. I liked the idea of going to this church because it was just a couple of doors down the hallway from my 8th grade class at Mercer Crest. We joined the church in 1954 when I was 14. Now, Jim Smith, who's here, shown here in this picture, was the chairman of the site committee for this church, and his team had managed to secure this property, which was originally part of what was called Lucas Pasture, where I used to pick my wild blackberries and hazelnuts. In 1955, as you can see, they're breaking the ground for this church.
Is it Jim on the right?
That's Jim on the right, and that's Clarence in the middle, and that's Joseph Bird on the left. The following year, the cornerstone of the church was laid. This is 1956. I had become the moderator of the youth group, and I was asked to place the mortar on the cornerstone to hold it in place. My participation in this is an example of this church's commitment to directly involving and recognizing its young people. Soon the Christian Education Center was completed, but it would be 6 more years before the sanctuary was built. My father, Ormy, was the chair of the building committee for the sanctuary, and here he's shown along with the architect, Paul Theory, and Clarence Sinclair. My dad, shown here looking at the construction as it's underway. This is a photo that I was just sent yesterday by Clarence Sinclair's daughter, and I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's quite an incredible shot, touched up of the sanctuary. Now, the light ring in the center of the sanctuary, under which people gather, and the cross, which is up in the front of the sanctuary, were forged by my father in his factory in Seattle, at a place called the Washington Iron Works. A company started in the 1870s by my great-grandfather, John Frink. That's where Frink Park in Seattle, if any of you have heard of that, that's where that comes from, my family, way back. The youth program of this church was known as Westminster Fellowship. Our high school group met on Sunday evenings, and it followed the WF curriculum, which included lessons on the pressing social and political issues of the day, the ones I remember most being nuclear war and segregation. Westminster Fellowship was unique in that it was organized on all the judicatory levels of the denomination. As a moderator of our local Westminster Fellowship, I also became the moderator of the South Seattle Youth Presbytery, as they called it. Then went on to be treasurer of the Youth Synod and a delegate to the Youth General Assembly at Grinnell College in Iowa in the summer of 1957. This is the front page of our handbook at that assembly. Our assembly got into the national news because we were the first group in the country to get hit with the Asian flu. The conference had to be cut short, and we had to go into isolation at Lake Forest College. We were quarantined there for several days. But 200 of our people had gotten sick, and the flu was spreading like wildfire as they went home. Some of them were carrying it and didn't know it. Anyway. In 1957, our adult advisor for our Westminster Fellowship group was Mr. Wichterman, my favorite high school teacher. Jim Wichterman was a very good friend, as some of you may know, of Milt Yannix, who's here today. Milt, thank you for coming. I know you miss Jim so much, and so do I. This church's first minister, Clarence Sinclair, was beloved by many, including me and my parents. Here he is in his Geneva bands. After he left the church in 1965, I stayed in touch with him, and following his death in 1991, I continued to stay in touch with his wife, Dorothy, who, I have to report to you, just had her 97th birthday and is going strong back in Maryland. Clarence was a person of true gentleness and humility, and he was also a fervent believer in the social gospel. That was reflected in his sermons. The principles of the social gospel were articulated early in the 20th century by Baptist minister and theologian Walter Rauschenbusch, who expressed the view that while the church's individualistic gospel made the necessary case for addressing the sinfulness of the individual, the church also needed to address the sinfulness of society and its institutions. And Clarence totally believed in that. Before joining this church, my parents each had a pretty strong individual moral compass and conscience. But it was because of Clarence and this church that they, particularly my mother, developed her social consciousness. She was the church's representative with the East Side Conference on Religion and Race, the Presbyterian Interracial Council. She belonged to Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP, and on and on. And she organized a group of 10 women on the island in Bellevue called the Committee of 10 that made it their purpose to bring about open housing in the communities, where people would agree, sign a pledge that they would sell their property to someone no matter what their race or religion. That was controversial at that time. In 1964, my mom decided not just to encourage racial integration on the island, but to take it upon herself to integrate the island. Personally. So she heard about a black family in Meridian, Mississippi that were being mistreated and invited them to come and live in our house on the west side of the island, this house. For this, my parents lost a number of friends, and the neighbor next to us, who had always let us use their path down to the lake to swim, would not let these black kids use their path. You know, that was so outrageous to me. But my mother had a lot of support for her activities, and she was named Mercer Island's Mother of the Year in 1965. She is shown here with my sister and the 2 Waterhouse girls. I graduated from Mercer Island High School in 1958 as a member of the school's first graduating class. So we became the top class in the high school as sophomores, and then as juniors, and then as seniors, and they filled in behind us, you know. So we have a pretty high opinion of ourselves.
Where are you there?
Where am I? I'm very small. I don't have one of those.
The last row is one of,
Yeah,
that's a girl level,
that's a girl.
13
There. Look. Circle. Oh yeah, there's the circle.
The high school's educational philosophy was to teach us not what to think, but how to think. And there I learned the intellectual values of objectivity, logical thinking, and rigorous scholarship, values which were as important in my life as the moral, social, and spiritual values I learned at this church. In the fall of 1962, I enrolled in Yale, and I took these values with me. However, my liberal theology was descending dangerously down a slippery slope toward Unitarianism. This was very concerning to Clarence. And he wrote a letter, which I've only learned about recently. I didn't know about it at the time. He wrote a letter to the chaplain of Yale, Bill Coffin.
William Sloan Coffin?
William Sloan Coffin.
Oh my
Okay,
goodness.
so he's writing to William Sloan Coffin about me, and here's what he says. Let's see. I'll quote it here. I don't have it. Oh yeah. It was interesting to discover this summer that Tony did not attend our services more than once or twice, and I discovered that he had visited the local Unitarian church a number of times. During Tony's high school years, he was in a running debate with some of his classmates on the Unitarian issue, which is a very live one in our community. Any counseling help and guidance you can give him during his university experience would be deeply appreciated. Yeah, so that's a kind of precious letter to me. The Unitarian Church to which he's referring is East Shore Unitarian, whose minister, Chad Spring, would come to this church and preach in pulpit exchanges with Clarence. So I knew of him. And I had friends at the high school who were in that congregation. Chad and Clarence had theological differences, but they were very good friends. So Bill Coffin and I ended up having a number of great talks while I was at Yale. We stayed in contact over the years in the context of the civil rights and anti-war movements. I will always remember this. I want to tell you one story about Bill. I'll always remember. I went back to New Haven for the 10th year anniversary of my class. And I got together with Bill for lunch. On our way to lunch, we picked up the New York Times at a book stand. And when we sat down for lunch, we noticed an item on page 1 about a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate.
Oh.
We read the article. I knew that Bill had been in the CIA before he became disillusioned with the agency and became a Presbyterian minister. So I asked him, I said, Bill, do you think this could be a CIA job? And you can probably predict what he said. No, they would never bungle something this badly.
Oh.
Not that they wouldn't do it, but they wouldn't bungle it if they did. In 1961, while still in college, I got married to Ruth Dunlap. Both of us were way too young to be married, and it's remarkable that the marriage lasted the 10 years that it did. Ruth is the daughter of A. Taylor Dunham. And I want to tell you this story. Taylor was for many years the stated clerk of the Seattle Presbytery. Right? Northminster Presbyterian was his congregation. And as Jim Smith knows, there's a very close connection between Taylor and this church. Does anybody else know that? Okay. I didn't know it for a while. In January 1952, Taylor, as the chair of the Presbytery's Church Extension Board, got in touch with his old friend Clarence Sinclair at Princeton and asked him if he might come out from Princeton to initiate the process of starting a church on Mercer Island. So Taylor is in many ways the originator of your church. Because he's the one that made it happen and got Clarence here to help him make it happen. In 1962, I graduated from the college with a major in philosophy, and then I came back to the Seattle area where our wonderful daughter Laurel was born, and I worked at the Washington Iron Works, and I definitely didn't feel fulfilled working there, to say the least. And I tried to figure out what to do with my life.
As your family's
Company. Yeah. I had no talent as a cost accountant, but that's what they do, right? So, trying to figure out what to do, and I got nominated for a Rockefeller Trial Year Fellowship for studying for 1 year at a seminary. A fellowship restricted to people like myself who were not planning to become ministers at that point. And also restricted, as these photos make clear, to white men. Yeah, I mean, this would not happen today, thank God. Look at all the women who are becoming, ministers now, and so on. Anyway, that was a different time. In the fall of 1963, I enrolled in San Francisco Theological Seminary in San Anselmo. That's a Presbyterian seminary on the West Coast. And there I had an opportunity to take seminars with incredible thinkers, theologians, and scholars, including Ted Gill, the president, Ben Reist, Maggie Kuhn, Noel Friedman, and James Meilenberg. As my Old Testament professor, James Meilenberg, planted seeds in my mind that would only later sprout when I pursued my PhD in religion and wrote a dissertation in the field of biblical studies. But while I was in seminary, I liked these classes, but my main focus was really on social action and the interaction of church and society. I was able to do my field work at St. Andrew Presbyterian Church, the only racially mixed congregation in Marin County. There I was able to work under the Reverend Don Schilling, a minister who was on the very front lines of the denomination's civil rights work, not only locally, but in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where he worked at considerable personal risk during the Freedom Summers down there. He worked at a lot more risk than I did when I went the following spring to be part of the Selma to Montgomery March. I was part of a crew of 30 seminarians who went down there as the latrine crew. for the march.
Mm.
We did have to lie down in the beds of the trucks that transported us ahead of the marchers because there were snipers, or so they thought. But we were actually being quite well protected by the U.S. Army, which was on either sides of us as we went on up ahead. Our experience in Selma and Montgomery was made possible because our seminary president, Ted Gill, former editor of Christian Century magazine, right, was very close to Martin Luther King. He's the one who gave the invocation at the demonstration, at the rally in Montgomery at the end of the march. And King asked Gill if he might be able to send some of his seminarians down there to help out. Here's Gill marching with John Lewis and Andy Young. You may know those names. This church was my sponsor on that trip, for that trip. And this is the letter that Clarence sent me after our trip was over. And I later came here and preached and talked to the congregation about my experience down there. During the summer of 1966, I went to work for the Synod of the Golden Gate in the West Oakland area, California, doing community organizing for the urban office of the Synod. For that work, the Synod required that I be trained as an organizer by Saul Alinsky, the founder of the modern community organizing movement. The head of the Synod's urban office and our supervisor was the Reverend Bill Grace, who was a friend of Saul's. So I had the privilege of spending a week at the Asilomar Conference Grounds in Pacific Grove, learning the tricks to community organizing under the master. Following year, I graduated from the seminary. And I was offered a position as a postgraduate intern at Howard Presbyterian Church in the Haight-Ashbury. Now, this was a summer of love. And one of my main responsibilities was going to be to run an anti-war coffee house in the basement of the church. This is my dream job. The person who oversaw the urban internship program was the Reverend George Todd of the Board of National Missions. Some of you may have heard of him. He's one of the true saints of the church, who after that job went on to become the head of international urban ministries for the World Council of Churches, and then the executive presbyter for the Synod for the Presbytery of New York. He's been a lifelong friend, and he just had his 90th birthday. One of the first things I did after getting this job at Howard was to pay a visit to David Harris and his girlfriend Joan Baez down in East Palo Alto. They were organizing a group called the Resistance, which is a draft resistance movement. And I asked if there was anything I could do for their cause. And that conversation led to the coffee house at the church becoming the San Francisco headquarters for the Resistance. I got to know Joan doing dishes with her in the kitchen and learned that she was an extremely nice and humble person. I myself joined the resistance and turned in my draft card, which with others was delivered to Bill Coffin at Yale and taken by him to the Justice Department. For turning in my card, I was reclassified by my Seattle draft board, which sent me a new 1A card, meaning I was eligible for induction. Okay. Now, I came to Seattle and met with the draft board, where I turned in that card stapled to a Bible with passages underlined that they should read to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. And as I later learned from the clerk there, it's a funny story that my Bible caused quite a headache for them because they didn't want to rip the card out of the Bible to be desecrated. So they had to build a special shelf because it wouldn't fit in the vertical files. They had to build a special shelf for my Bible. Now, the Reverend Bill Tatum at the time was instrumental in organizing with me a worship service in the lobby of the Federal Building following my appearance with the draft board. Bill had asked the draft board if he could come with me to my hearing. They didn't go for that. Shortly after all this, the Supreme Court ruled that reclassifying people for protest actions, like refusing to carry a draft card, was unconstitutional. And we were off the hook. That was the Warren Court, of course. I received a wonderful letter from the Presbytery's Commission on Religion and Race about what I had done. And on Memorial Day, at the University of Washington, I was given recognition by the local Seattle Ad Hoc Committee for a Vietnam Convocation, a group spearheaded by Giovanni Costigan. And another person honored that day at the same ceremony with me at the UW was Muhammad Ali. So I was in good company. A few years later, when I filed a Freedom of Information request and obtained my FBI file, I learned that the FBI had been keeping quite close track of my draft resistance activities. With my one-year postgraduate internship being over at the beginning of the summer of 1968, the urban office hired me to be a co-pastor of a new ecumenical church in Berkeley, along with an Episcopal minister, Dick York. It was called the Berkeley Free Church. And we were engaged in a lot of anti-war activity, but also in providing social services to young people who hung out on Telegraph Avenue, including drug counseling, temporary shelter, and a free medical clinic. We started this clinic during the People's Park disturbances because when injured protesters went to the main hospital for treatment, they were arrested there because the cops were waiting for them. So we set up a clinic in our church so that people could get treated for injuries in the riots that were going on and not be arrested. Well, the Free Church may have closed down after a few years, but the Berkeley Free Clinic lives on, as can be seen in this recent photo of that amazing organization. In July 1968, my attention turned from draft resistance to resistance that was going on against the war inside the military. 9 military men who were AWOL, who became known as the 9 for Peace, surfaced in the Bay Area and said they wanted to go public with their resistance to the war. We gathered at the Howard Presbyterian Church. We held a press conference, and we waited for the military police to come. With 9 of us who were ministers chained to the 9 resistors. Well, there was a bomb threat, forced our group to leave the Howard Church. I called Don Schilling at the St. Andrew Presbyterian Church, where I'd done my field work earlier, and said, could we come there? And he said that we consisted of about 100 folks, were welcome to come and encamp in their sanctuary, which we did. Well, the military police finally came while we were having a communion service. We invited them to join us in the service, but they instead forcibly removed us with wine spilling all over the place. This shot from the film Sir, No Sir shows me and the Marine to whom I am chained being taken in the parking lot of St. Andrew Church and being escorted to a paddy wagon where we will be taken from there to the Presidio. Something called the Submarine Church developed out of an effort by some of us with the Berkeley Free Church to link up with other young adult and anti-war ministries across the country to confront the mainline church denominations over the issue of the war. One of the friends that the Submariners made in Berkeley was with folk singer Malvina Reynolds. Some of you may have heard of her. She has songs, Little Boxes, Magic Penny, others that I think you'd recognize if you heard them. She lived next door to the Free Church, and she would come and sing at our Free Church services on Saturday nights, which usually had about 500 people. These were in the main churches of the area. We had more people coming to our services on Saturday night than they did on Sunday mornings. It was a popular thing for a while. Well, one evening Malvina, came to dinner at the house where a bunch of the Submariners were living. And I happened to make some split pea soup for the group that evening. She was inspired to write a song about her evening with us called Tony's Soup. Here's one of the stanzas of it, which mentions the submarine.
Tony's.
Yeah. So, the Submarine Church carried out anti-war actions at national meetings of church denominations. At the United Methodist Quadrennial Meeting in St. Louis, we called on the Methodists to denounce the war, and part of what happened was that 31 of us were arrested by the St. Louis police with help from the FBI, as we later learned, for disrupting a religious ceremony, a law that they had in St. Louis. The United Methodist Church denomination, however, felt called to defend us. Did not decide to defend the local church that had made this happen, but us. And charges were then thrown out. We then went to the Presbyterian General Assembly in Chicago in May 1970, where we were given 30 minutes to speak, calling on them to denounce the war. And this provoked a lot of controversy. The moderator, however, Bill Laws, amazing guy, diffused much of the tension created when, after we finished our talk, he invited the Submarine Church to come hear him preach the next morning, and then took us to lunch. So here, my friend Peter Searsma and I are shown having lunch with Bill Laws and his wife. This is in Presbyterian life. Well, as all this was happening in Chicago, the Synod of the Golden Gate was terminating the Reverend Bill Grace as head of the urban office. His replacement was hostile to both the Submarine Church and the Free Church. Presbyterian funding for the projects came to a halt, and the submarine headed back down into the depths. I began looking for other work, and I went into a period of real retrenchment and reassessment of my life and my priorities. At this time, I gave a controversial sermon at Northminster Presbyterian, and as you can see, I had let my hair grow. Around this time, when I would come from California to Mercer Island to visit my parents, I would often arrive about 5 p.m. and my dad, or me, would invariably say to me, "Bones," yeah, that's what he called me, Bones. "Bones, I think the barbershop is still open." In 1971, you can see I'm traveling on this passport. Went to the Middle East, investigating the origins of religion in the Near East, ancient Near East. Later that year, I got divorced. In 1973, I met my wife Nancy, who's here today. We've been married since then. Meanwhile, as a result of ongoing power struggles in the Synod, I was again back in favor there. A guy named Bert Tom had been hired. So I was hired by the new church development office to go to the Noe Valley neighborhood of San Francisco, which happened to be where we were living, to phase out the historic Lebanon Presbyterian Church and lay the foundations for a more robust ministry, shall we say, that would become the Noe Valley Ministry Presbyterian Church, still going strong now, more than 40 years later. But I was ready to go back to school. In 1975, we moved to Syracuse, New York, where I spent the next 5 years in the PhD program with the Department of Religion at Syracuse. In my studies, I took courses on Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, and there I got my first chance to teach religion to undergraduates as a teaching assistant.
How did you support yourself during that?
I was also working for the action agency of the federal government full-time, plus having a family, etc. It was a crazy, crazy time. I should tell you. Yeah. Well, during this crazy time, I was becoming more aware of the importance for members of religions to have respect for and learn from other religions. An impetus for this realization was Professor Huston Smith, one of my professors and one of the world's foremost writers and teachers on the subject of world religions. Huston, who died just 2 years ago, one day brought his friend the Dalai Llama to the campus, and as the graduate students in religion, we were most fortunate to have a special session with him. And both Nancy and I felt at that time that we were truly in the presence of an enlightened person. We really did. And Huston was that also. So they were a good pair. So I was finished with my studies at Syracuse, and I had everything finished except my dissertation. And we moved from Syracuse to Seattle. Nancy had fallen in love with Seattle when I brought her here, and we didn't have any other place to go particularly, so we came here. And I was hired by the Presbytery to be the executive director of Madrona Community Center. Some of you may have heard of that. It was located in the Madrona Presbyterian Church in the basement. When I started the job, I learned what an utter disaster the Presbytery and the local church had let that project become. Unbelievable, the neglect. It took me a year to build a board of directors composed of representatives of the local church, the Presbytery, and the community, and to initiate programs that served the community. Now here, with extra funds secured from Seattle area foundations to supplement that given by the Presbytery, we were able to hire other staff, including this very interesting gentleman who was a most gentle and responsible person who went by the name of Monad. Nobody ever knew his last name. Monad. And he was the one who ran our very successful summer camp program for young people each summer. With these funds, I was also able to hire this fellow, Steve Sneed, who directed our Madrona Youth Theater program. Members of a number of churches in Seattle were able to attend performances there at the community center by the youth theater. Now, my wife, Nancy, is Jewish, and since we've been together, we have had many Passover dinners at our house, and our two boys have both had their bar mitzvahs. Here is our son Doran, who's here today, reading from the Torah scroll at his bar mitzvah at Temple de Hirsch. Our younger son Joel studied for his bar mitzvah with Rabbi Jim Morrell. Anybody remember him? And the service was held at Temple B'nai Torah, which at that time was located here on Mercer Island. Rabbi Morrell and Temple B'nai Torah had what I would call a very interfaith attitude, and that's reflected in the fact that they had me give the sermon for that Shabbat service, that Saturday morning. And the fact that I was up there giving that sermon in a synagogue made a huge impression on my mother and father-in-law. And their attitude toward me did quite a remarkable shift. Right? Okay, so 1993, I finished my dissertation and I received a PhD from Syracuse University. This is what the dissertation was entitled. I love to talk about all this stuff, but I won't do that right now. I will say that for my dissertation, I returned to the field of biblical studies, and I began pursuing the question of the origins of the biblical God. This led me to Mesopotamia. For this, I learned to read cuneiform texts like this one on this tablet, which I'll just tell you, this tablet is one of 500,000 tablets spanning 35 centuries that have been dug up and deciphered by scholars, and it's a treasure trove for understanding the religions of the ancient Near East, and in my opinion, a treasure trove for understanding the origins of the Abrahamic religions, including Christianity. The following year, I began teaching religion to undergraduates as an adjunct professor in universities of this area, including Pacific Lutheran, Seattle, University of Washington, and Seattle U, which is where I did most of my teaching. The course which I regard as the most important one I taught at Seattle U is called Christian-Muslim Dialogue. At the conclusions of these courses, the students and I would host a Christian-Muslim dialogue event for the campus community. This is an invitation to one of those events in 2006. Jamal Rahman, any of you know him? Yeah. So he's a Sufi. He's a minister with the Interfaith Community Church in Seattle, and he was a primary speaker at these Christian-Muslim dialogue events. Amazing guy. In the mid-2000s, I began to get re-involved with this church. And I joined the Presbyterian Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee. At this church in 2003, Lee Cease, who I think is not here, but I was hoping he could come. Lee Cease and I were honored to preach dialogue sermons at each of the 3 Sunday morning services on the occasion of this church's 50th year anniversary. In 2004, I taught an introductory 6-week course here on Islam, and I think a couple of you here were in that course. The Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee of Seattle Presbytery, under the leadership of Shannon Parks Beck, shown here. She was a musician as well as a social justice advocate. The SJP gave me the opportunity to be involved in helping to sponsor events for the Presbytery and the community. In March 2006, at a Presbytery meeting at this church where I spoke, we successfully brought Overture 64, the No to Torture Overture, which came out of San Francisco Presbytery. We brought it before the Seattle Presbytery, and they endorsed it. It went on to be passed by the General Assembly in this 2006 meeting. We also held a Waging Peace colloquium at Newport Presbyterian, a colloquium on the human and spiritual cost of the Iraq War at University Presbyterian, and in 2008, we sponsored an event called Restoring God's Peace with Justice with Dr. Richard Mao, president of Fuller Seminary, being our plenary speaker. Well, despite all the productivity of this Social Justice and Peacemaking Committee, the Presbytery, in its wisdom, decided it was time for some restructuring, and they abolished the committee. So I went on to do some other things. Beginning in 2009, I got involved here on Mercer Island in starting a new scholarship at the high school. The scholarship was named after President Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, with whom I went to the high school here on the island. Okay? A lot of people don't know about that. That she was at the high school. This scholarship is for girls graduating from the high school, and this is a shot of the applicants for the first year's scholarship, which was awarded in 2010. It's now been going for 10 years. They're incredible young women who are identified for their idealism and who want to make the world a better place that we give the scholarship to. Obama makes an annual donation to the scholarship, and his sister Ng Sotero has been very involved in our efforts here on the island on behalf of the scholarship. She was our special guest in 2013, and this photo shows Jim Wichterman, who was my favorite high school teacher and who was the advisor for our youth group here at this church. It shows Jim Wichterman telling Maya about how much her brother Barack reminds him of their mother when she was in his classes at Mercer Island High School. So I'm glad I got this photo.
Yeah.
In 2016, Maya came again to Mercer Island as the scholarship's guest, and in addition to her activities with the scholarship, she preached at her mother's church, East Shore Unitarian. We come back to them. Her sermon was titled, Building Bridges of Faith Through Courageous Compassion. More folks attended that service at East Shore than at any other service in their history, and that's a long history. And Maya was a huge hit with those who attended. The scholarship has expanded and now includes a second scholarship for girls at Rainier Beach High School. So we're getting off the island. And it will be holding its 10th annual awards ceremony next May. Maya will be joining us again, and I invite you all to come. That's my story about my involvement with religion.
Ask any questions you can think of.
Any comments?
Yeah, I've got one. And going back to Westminster Fellowship,
Yeah.
Tony, were all the churches in the Presbytery doing that?
Yeah, just about all of them.
I mean, yeah.
It was a denominations
Well, I
program.
know it, but you know, when we talked about
Yeah.
social justice, but the evolution of things didn't stay in that track in this Presbytery. This Presbytery has kind of got the reputation of being very conservative now.
It was then too. But there were a number of congregations who were not that conservative, this one being one of them,
Yes.
right? There was Newport, there was Woodland Park, others,
Yeah,
and they were using the denomination's curriculum.
yeah,
But I can't really tell you how many churches were and how many weren't.
okay, but
But
yeah.
it's a good question, because
Yeah, because that would shape the youth, you see, for
Yeah.
the whole future.
yeah, I mean, this presbytery has been for a long time, and it all traces back to First Presbyterian,
Right.
right? It's been very conservative. I mean, in 1956, when the denomination took up the matter of ordaining women to the ministry, and it passed the General Assembly, when it went to the presbyteries, it was defeated here. I mean, that's just one of many, many
Okay,
examples of
okay.
this presbytery being on the conservative, in the very conservative side of the denomination. However, this is a denomination which I have so much respect for, which enables congregations to be what they can be, and has a national presence in our country and in the world that really supports liberal social values. It supported civil rights, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah, it is. That's why
So
I'm Presbyterian.
I mean, so it is sometimes kind of for me a love-hate relationship, but I do have immense respect for this denomination. And the presbytery, I mean, we can talk about how conservative it is, but the Social Justice Committee was something they decided to do just 10 years ago. It was very successful. We put on programs at University Presbyterian. That's not the most liberal church in the Presbyterian, right? So it's a mixed bag, right? Jim?
Well, Tony, for a period of time, I chaired the Christian Education Committee of Presbyterian. And we finally discovered...
Can everybody hear Jim? Speak up.
Well, I discovered in just the little things you do, you learn about the community. It was, to whom would we mail the information publicizing workshops on Presbyterian Church curriculum? And we found that over half of the churches in the presbytery used other than Presbyterian curriculum. And once they realized that our committee, that included people from various points of view of use of curriculum, that we were promoting the Presbyterian denominational curriculum for our church schools and youth programs, they pledged to each other never to attend any more of our Presbyterian Christian education workshops. And
Yeah.
it just kind of went, and over here, there was a handful of churches that used and appreciated our Presbyterian curriculum, which was marvelous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, for the youth especially. And you and I were talking on the phone recently of the curriculum that was available for WF, Westminster Fellowship. 5 commissions.
Yeah.
And the one commission was, I don't know what they called it, social justice, it was a church and society.
Right, is that,
Yeah. And
yeah, Rob would remember maybe. Is that
Sure.
what it was called? Church and Society.
But the thing is, that over here, was the rest of the churches that just wrote off the Presbyterian. So we've been pretty divided over the years in that. It was disappointing, but you keep plugging away.
But the diversity of the presbytery makes it possible, if we would take the opportunity to do it, and it's not easy, to get into dialogue with one another, coming from different points of view, right?
And the dialogue would take place, believe it or not, in prayer.
Sure.
Because when different ones in the clergy was aware of family concerns or illness or hospitalization of other clergy and get together, it's amazing the bridges that builds
Sure,
with our program and
Yeah.
Presbyterian
Yeah.
committee.
Yeah.
wouldn't-
Other questions? Jim?
I have a theory about the founding of our church as well as Taylor Dunlap's involvement. And I'm asking you a question if you know anything to substantiate it.
Huh?
And it is that our church started, we had 2 sisters, Margaret Gates,
Yeah, Hillary
Yeah.
Gates, yeah.
Ruth Prosser,
Mm-hmm.
who were sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the daughters of, I believe it's Lawrence Mitchell, who was pastor of a church on Queen Anne Hill. And Ruth Prosser lived in the island, and Margaret lived up on Hilltop. Her husband was a professor at the U. Anyway, I have a theory that they were involved in our church as well, and sparked somebody's idea, maybe Dunlap's, I don't know, but somebody that led to the comedy assignment to involve Clarence and get our church going. And I wonder if you have any input on that.
No, but I bet that's part of the story.
Yeah,
You know,
it is.
and it needs to
Mildred
be.
Gates was at Covenant Shores, and I got acquainted with her, and she talked, about that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's,
She was quite a lady.
yeah, I mean, so Taylor's just one piece of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, anybody?
Was there a time when the national organization, the Presbyterian, wanted to remove you because of your politics?